First, let's talk about the recent news that the Trump-Xi call. What do you think that is about, and do you think it actually portends any change in the U.S.-China relationship?
I think that there's a few things. Well, it's good to be with you. Well, it's nice that that your community of viewers, thought that I was worth listening to. So that's it's very flattering. And in fact, if people don't think flattery works, it's because they've never been flattered in their lives. So so thank you again. What can we say? The first thing I think of interest, and perhaps it's a bit of passing interest before getting into the substance of it, is that there was a lot of excitement yesterday on the news of the phone call, not so much because there was a phone call, but because the media, in the mainstream at least, broke that the call was initiated by the China side, and a whole bunch of people jumped on that and got very excited by all of this, waxing on about how it's the first time since 1991, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, 24 hours later, and having allowed the dust to settle, both sides actually acknowledged that the call was initiated by Washington, not by Beijing. So in some respects, all of that excitement was for naught. I guess the lesson out of all of that is before folk jump to any of these sorts of grand conclusions, that perhaps they should just take half a step back, take a few deep breaths, go for a walk, and then have a look at what actually happened in the coolness of day. Let time pass a little bit. It probably also says something about how the mainstream Western media is perpetually looking for some angle on something, right? And to a point where they're making so much stuff up these days, it's hard to keep up with what's going on. The substance of the call, I think, clearly dealt with probably two main things. One was, in some respects, a follow-up operational call post-Busan and the agreements reached in relation to the trade-related issues, and clearly those issues were primary of concern insofar as President Trump's own social media readout was concerned. On the China side, it touched on those issues, but it also was quite specific that the question of Taiwan was raised, and it was raised in the context of an historical dynamic, and that is that the United States and China were actually allies in the war against Japanese fascism and aggression, and that the resolution of the Taiwan question, particularly in the context of the Japanese Prime Minister's recent comments about Taiwan, that the resolution of the Taiwan question is actually a finalization of the post-Second World War settlement. And therefore, President Xi was drawing a very strong thread of continuity between the alliance in the Second World War against Japanese aggression and the finalization of China's reunification. Now, I don't think that necessarily changes anything in a daily sense, but quite clearly, the Chinese framing of the Taiwan question vis-a-vis the United States and Japan within that broader historical arc, I think is worth noting. I don't seem to recall that particular framing ever being emphasized, certainly not for a long time, if in fact it had been. Funnily enough, and perhaps not so funny, perhaps predictably enough, a whole bunch of folk, who are hostile to the idea of Chinese reunification and who are mainly Westerners in favour of Taiwanese independence, leapt on this and saying, this is outrageous. The Allies during the Second World War was actually the ROC and the KMT and the United States, not the communists. Well, that's a pretty cheap trick to play, really, because at the end of the day, the war was actually between countries, and if you wanted to follow the logic of those folk, you'd actually say that the Americans were never involved in the war either, but it was actually a war engaged in by the Democratic Party. So China was an ally of the United States during the Second World War. and that's the end of the story, right? It continues all the way through because guess what? Regardless of which side of the Civil War you landed on, you both think that you're fighting over the one China, and you both still think that there is only one China, and you both actually still have the view officially that the Civil War hasn't concluded. So, I think we are moving inexorably towards a resolution of this question, this historical question, and perhaps the call between Xi and Trump and the way that it was framed from the Chinese side was in many regards laying the groundwork for this next chapter, that to bring to an end this loose thread.
Yeah, and I think you're right. This is the first time China bring up the historical settlement of World War II, and U.S. and China should be upholder of the post-war global framework. But in more recent years, China had used similar language with Russia, for example. That is more in reference to kind of the historical revisionism that's going on in Europe about Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazism. And this is the first time I've seen this has been kind of applied to East Asia. And also what China wanted to emphasize was that Taiwan was returned to China at the end of World War II. People should not forget that. And a lot of people try to obfuscate around the issue, like you mentioned. They say, "Oh, ROC was a victor of the war, not the communists. So this has nothing to do with the communists." But as far as the government in Beijing concerned, it's all China. Taiwan was returned to China. That is the end of the story. Now, what we have right now is a issue that's from history that's to be resolved between Chinese people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Nobody else should be butting in and interfering in a Chinese internal matter. And this in particular is a reference to recent statement made by the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, and it looks like immediately followed the Xi Jinping Trump call. Trump actually made a call to Takaichi, and according to the Japanese readout, only thing they said was that the talk was friendly, but they released no details other than that. So it almost seems like Trump made a call to Japan and telling them, "Okay, you got to calm down. We don't need to stir up another big flash spot in East Asia at this particular point." Which seems to give credence to the view that right now U.S. is doing a tactical pivot, not a strategic pivot, but a tactical pivot from East Asia to elsewhere, maybe to Venezuela or to Nigeria in Africa. Do you think this pertains to a possible détente between U.S. and China at this point, at this juncture?
I suspect not. What I think we're seeing is a recalibration of means and method rather than strategic objectives. So the United States has for a long time had a strategic view, its national security doctrine, which in essence says that the security of the United States is contingent upon American dominance of the world. And that includes, of course, its position in East Asia just as much as it included its position in Eastern Europe. So if you looked at the map, you do see the United States bookending the Eurasian continent and ensuring that the peripheries on those bookends were fragmented and divided in ways that would destabilize the other great powers in this landmass. So I don't think the United States has actually shifted its strategic objectives, which is global hegemony and in the name of American national security. What it has had to do is confront reality, and its reality is defined by the fact that it is not now in a world where it no longer is the unquestioned unipolar hegemon. That's the first thing. We have seen on the European end the re-emergence of Russia as a great power. I mean, Russia's always been a nuclear power. Let's never forget that. But insofar being an economic power, a cultural power, a diplomatic power, and arguably a civilizational power, this has been a relatively recent turn of events. It's certainly far more than a gas station masquerading as a country. The second thing is that China's emergence over the course of the last 80 years to a point today where it is, in many respects, a peer of the United States, and in other respects is more than a peer of the United States, I think has reshaped the question of the balance of power. So the United States is seeking to modulate how it pursues its strategic objectives. And it's doing that in large part by cultivating proxies to carry on the burden, to take the brunt of any of the pressures that come from being at the front line, and to carry some of the financial costs as well. And we've seen how that's played out tragically in Ukraine, and clearly in terms of how it's mobilizing Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, it's seeking to do similar things. So I don't think the United States has fundamentally at this point in time come to a view that it's in the business of reframing coexistence with China. It does still seek, particularly if you spend time reading through the think tank reports as well as the testimony given to congressional committees, the American body politic remains hot and bothered about China's development and its growth, and it will seek to do whatever it can to contain it at best, or if it can possibly do so, retard it. That's where I think things are at.
Now that I want to ask you that, well, it's obviously in America's interest to shift the burden to its vassal states like Japan and Europe. What is it in it for the vassals? What's in it for Japan, for example, to stir up the latest tension with China over Japanese Prime Minister's remark over how Japan might deploy military to a situation in Taiwan? Like, why? What does Japan gain, or I should say, what does these Japanese politicians gain from picking a fight with China at this particular juncture?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a few layers to all of this, of course. So at an individual level, the new Japanese Prime Minister, who came to office through an internal party ballot, needs to consolidate her position. She comes from the right-wing end of the political spectrum. She has a history of being an advocate for historical revisionism, both around the Second World War, broadly speaking, but also in terms of Japanese atrocities in China. So she comes from that part of the political spectrum, and in the processes of assuming the prime ministership, needs to consolidate that. In part, I think that this is part of the calculus, right? The second thing, of course, is that there's always muscle memory, institutional and political muscle memory. And we see this in many vassal or quasi-vassal countries where political elite ultimately internalize a particular way of thinking about their interests, meaning their country's national interests, in ways that subordinate that to the interests of the United States. So the basic sub-imperial reaction is that what's good for the United States, by definition, is good for us. So I think in part this is a muscle memory or a reflex maneuver. The third thing, though, is that I think the Japanese strategic and security and even economic institutions are concerned that, in fact, Japan is quite vulnerable, both economically and in a security sense within the region. And this recent intervention is an attempt to gain attention, don't forget us, and to curry favor, which is to reinforce the idea of don't forget us. Let's not forget the United States still has something like 55,000 troops in Japan under extraterritorial provisions. And so in some respects, the Japanese remain very dependent upon the United States for the provision of security. In broader regional terms, the Japanese economy is facing some significant headwinds. It's not in a particularly healthy state, and it really needs to find a way of improving its economic performance. And from a prime minister's point of view, part of the political problem is if the economy doesn't improve, you tend not to last too long anyway. The second issue, I think, which I think is kind of counterintuitive insofar as these recent interventions go, is that Japan also faces big issues with regional security, particularly the Korean Peninsula and the DPRK. You know, ruffling China's feathers and undermining the collaboration that you might have with China as a good office does not actually help the Japanese stabilize its relationships in the area or stabilize the region more generally. And I think that there's a longer term set of problems too, which I'm not sure the Japanese political elite have really thought hard about. Perhaps they're a bit too long term, and that goes to food and energy security. Japan is a major importer of energy. Over 90% of its energy needs are imported. It imports the majority of its food as well. And it needs to find a way of stabilizing these critical inputs. Otherwise, its social stability will progressively diminish to a point where its economy and society will cease to function properly. And all of that, I think, places incredible pressure on Japanese policymakers, because in many regards, the things that have given Japan comfort for 60, 70 years are things that are stopping its ability to resolve its future problems, right? So it's right in the middle of a contradiction at the moment.
I'm in complete agreement about the pending implosion of the Japanese economy, but wouldn't stirring up trouble with China worsen that situation? Like, for example, the Japanese tourism industry is immediately hit in the aftermath of this rising of tensions, and tourism composed of 7% of the Japanese GDP. And how is that gonna help to have this rising tension with China when a lot of Japanese firms, still depending on the Chinese market, for example?
Well, it's not, right? So this is the classic contradiction that Japan finds itself in now. And it's being squeezed economically by Washington through the imposition of tariffs, demands on Japanese investing surplus dollars into the American economy under the guidance of President Trump. So the Japanese policymakers, if you will, and politicians, of course, as a consequence, I think are actually in a very, very difficult historical position. And as I said, the legacy of what gave Japan its comfort for the past 7 decades or so since the end of the Second World War are actually the reasons that inhibits the ability of Japan to navigate a pathway through its challenges into the future. Japan's long-term economic interests are fundamentally tied to the region. And what that really means is that it needs to find a way of existing within a region where it benefits from regional stability whilst contributing to regional stability. At the moment, it can't do any of that, and so it is trapped by these muscle memory reactions, coupled with, I think, those very immediate political dynamics, which goes to the revitalization of nationalism, the sort of political inclinations of the current prime minister, given her political pedigree, and those sorts of things. But none of this helps Japan in the long run.
Let me see if I understand you correctly. So you're saying Japan's success is post-war in large part depending on its partnership with the United States, access to the U.S. market in particular. But now with the power balance is shifting to the east, with Asia Pacific becoming the most important dynamic region economically, Japan is having difficulty making that transition from depending on United States to reorient itself to Asia. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's right. And look, the big issues it needs to reorient itself to Asia is around energy and food, mixed in with, of course, regional stability and security. When it imports 90+% of its energy resources, it needs to find access to cheap energy, right? Cheap and stable energy. surprise, surprise, it actually has dispensation from its Western allies to continue with getting its gas from the Sakhalin project with the Russians. But that's just a symptom of its problems, right? With the United States at the moment pushing its European allies to essentially become an American gas client, the last thing Japan needs is to be trapped into that environment as well, because that's just going to be expensive energy. And it needs to find a way to having more independent, cheaper, more reliable energy. And there's only there's a couple of pathways, right? One of them is, of course, through upgrading nuclear capabilities in the event that it could do that. It would also need to look at the role of renewable energy, a la China. And of course, it needs to access, gas. And its best source of gas is actually from the far east of Russia. That's actually where Japan's future should be. If Japan had a blank slate to work from, I would think it would be working at ways of deepening its connectivity into northern China, into Siberia, because those parts of the world are actually rich in food and food capabilities, agricultural capabilities, and of course energy. With the warming of the Arctic, you'll also find that that part of the world will become even more accessible as time goes by, particularly for agriculture and also for energy as well. But Japan's trapped. It's trapped by post-war arrangements. It's trapped by the fact that it can't see its way out of its military alliances with the United States, and consequently is being pulled hither and thither.
That is a very, very incisive insight